Hello and welcome to Mindful Biology. This is our fifth and final session about sensitivity. Our bodies, as we've been discussing, are sensitive to all the stuff that goes on in the outer world, sight, sound, things that impinge upon our skin. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about the skin and how it protects the body and opens channels for us to sense tactile experience. Of course, the body is also sensitive to interior phenomena such as thought and emotion and bodily sensation, etc. If we take all of that sensitivity that detects both outside and inside changes, we have the sum total, really, of a human life. Because all that we experience is the combination of what's happening in the apparent outer world and the apparent inner world. We could say that is the universe that we experience. And so today we'll be talking about the so-called universe body, which brings all of the sensitivity together, although we'll be focusing, as we have been, on the skin and its contributions. So the universe body brings together all the other bodies that we've been discussing. To briefly review, the object body is the one that we think about as if it were separate from the so-called self. So this is the body of biology, and it's also the body that we sometimes criticize or feel anxious about, as if it were a separate thing that might fail us in the way it looks or the way it functions. The mammal body is the body of direct sensation, of feeling warm or cold, hungry or thirsty or satisfied or angry or sad or loved. Mammals are very social creatures, and primates and humans especially so, and so this is the body that feels supported at its best and feels isolated and lonely when things aren't going so well. The cell body is, as I understand it, the body of felt energetic movement, the background aliveness that we have as part of our experience everywhere we direct our attention. And the universe body is the whole of all of it, because every sensation or thought or emotion or perception that we consider part of our experience is coming to us through these biological functions of the cell body, the mammal body, and even the cognitive capacity of the object body, which itself is cellular in the nervous system, in the brain. From earlier discussions, the point was made that the object and mammal bodies tend to contribute to the difficult experiences we associate with suffering. So we can think frightening or sad or angry thoughts, and that can create a kind of suffering. And we can have frightening or sad and angry feelings in the mammal body, and those too often give us a sense of suffering, particularly if we feel resistant to them. And of course, our thoughts and our emotions play off one another, and we can get caught into amplifying cycles where a thought creates an unpleasant feeling, and an unpleasant feeling creates a negative thought, and so on. In contrast, more stable experiences are available when we tune into the diffuse background feeling of aliveness, or when we begin to have a felt understanding of how the body is, in a certain sense, everywhere in our experience. It's in the sights and the sounds and the feeling of the earth below us, and of course everything else. And once we begin to feel universally alive and, in a certain sense, diffuse and connected with everything around us, this also is a stable and actually rather pleasant experience that supports equanimity. So the idea through this whole series has been to begin tuning into the channels that support equanimity and spending less time focused on the channels that contribute to suffering. And today we're looking at the last of the channels that we're investigating, the universe body. Now, I need to emphasize that this is all a bit arbitrary. Human experience could be divided up in many other ways, and in different psychological and spiritual traditions it has been. So this is just one approach to clarifying our human experience and moving in the direction of making it feel more stable and equanimous. So as part of our object-body experience, we can bring a scientific perspective to bear on our human skin. So I could take a little scraping off my skin and look at it under a microscope and see cells and identify different types of cells and understand what they're doing and so on. This would be a very common approach for the objectifying function of mind. So you recall the objectifying function takes some part of our experience, gives it a name, and looks at it as if it's separate from the function of mind that is doing the thinking and the analyzing and the objectifying. Because making an object out of that other feature is the central aspect of analysis, I'm calling this function of mind the objectifier. It could go by other names, and again, it has been called by other names. So the objectifier is the part of us that is looking at our bodies and our experiences as separate entities, things in their own right. And this can be a very powerful approach and has led to a lot of scientific advancement. It's important, though, to keep in mind that the objectifier can lock into certain assumptions and certain habitual ways of viewing biology, viewing our bodies, viewing our experience, and those aren't necessarily accurate. I think we're all aware that people can believe things that are not true. Here we're looking at a single cell, a free-living organism, which we have all heard about, called a paramecium. So the paramecium here is, sort of moving through its environment, kind of making turns, picking out bits of food as it goes. Now, I have no direct knowledge of what the paramecium might or might not be experiencing. But as I look at it feeding, it seems at least possible that it is moving under the influence of inner sensations of needing food and then finding it, and maybe slight pulses of satisfaction. So maybe on a very rudimentary level, there's a very minor but real interior experience of, let us say, hunger and then satisfaction. As a comparison, we could look at this much larger and more complicated organism, a swan. I don't think any of us really doubt that the swan has inner experience, and as it circles around its environment, picking out bits of food, it looks, at least superficially, very similar to the paramecium, kind of moving around, finding what it needs, and presumably, feeling a little bit of hunger and a little bit of satisfaction. The alternative view is that the paramecium, the individual cell, is more of a mechanism, that it's responding to inbuilt programming and really feels nothing. A simplistic comparison would be this mechanical bird that we're watching here. The crank is turned, the bird, moves its head through its environment, maybe not all that differently from the swan or the paramecium, but we don't have any belief that this contraption actually feels anything. It's simply a mechanical device. Well, I don't want to make the comparison too simplistic, so we'll look at another mechanical device. So here's a robot that someone built, and you can view this online on YouTube. The credits are at the end of this video. And as we watch it move around, we can see that it is, in some sense, responding to its environment. It has different behavior patterns. It seems to cue in when things change, etc. Now, I have no idea whether this device has any inner experience or not, and my suspicion is it may very well be simply mechanical, but it has the appearance, in a way, of having some sort of intentionality or interiority. So the point here is that we just can't tell, really, by looking. We just don't know without additional information. In the case of the paramecium, I think it's important to remember that the paramecium is a living biological cell, and that the swan that we assume has interior experience is simply a larger conglomeration of probably trillions of cells. And since the basic unit is the same in both cases, it's at least reasonable to think the cell might have the same kind of interior experience as the swan. Again, impossible to be sure. Whereas in the case of the little robot, we know it's made out of circuit boards and computer systems that, as far as we know, don't have interior experience, although even that's a kind of assumption. And so, the two are not comparable in the same way as the cell and the swan. It's made out of completely different materials and completely different systems. Well, if we can't be sure, my suggestion is that it makes sense to think of individual cells, and particularly the individual cells of our body, as having an interior experience, for the reason that as mammals we have such a strong need to feel supported by other living beings. This is why we want to be close to our loved ones, our family members and friends. It's why we so easily bond to animals like dogs and cats and horses and so on. We have a very strong evolutionary need to be close to other living beings. And if we can experience our bodies as made up of trillions of individual living beings, each with a little bit of interior experience, we can begin to feel surrounded and embedded in a community of life. And our mammalian nature can find that very satisfying and very stress relieving. So we can look at our daily experience, a fairly common but pleasant experience, let's say, of walking along a seashore, feeling the soft, moist, squishy sand with its kind of grittiness underfoot and maybe squeezing between the toes, the cool water washing over the tops of the feet, a slight breeze fluttering the garment and stimulating the skin of the calves and the shins, etc. A very interesting and complex sensory experience as we walk upon the earth and feel it supporting us from below. This is what human experience is often like. We may not tune into all of its different elements so carefully, but it's there. This experience of tactile richness is coming, as we've discussed in earlier sessions, from a variety of sensing systems made up of living cells embedded in the skin. And they provide these different sensations of, for instance, texture and temperature and pressure and light touch and even caress. Well, those sensors are communicating with this large biological system we call a brain, with its billions of cells. The tactile information is concentrated along a strip on the surface of the brain shown here. So we can see a kind of map of the body in this image that shows how the sensors are sending information in a regional fashion. So all the sensors around the eye, for instance, are sending a lot of information to where the eye is depicted in the image. So we can see how this map of the body spreads over the outside surface and dives down into the midline of the brain. And there's actually two such maps, one on each hemisphere of the brain. So the cellular sensors in the skin are communicating with information processing cells in the brain. And here we're looking at a section of a very small region of the brain showing how densely packed the cells there are. In fact, this image only shows about 1 out of every 1,000 brain cells, so the actual density is 1,000 times higher. When we zoom in, we can see how these cells are all nestled against one another in a very tightly packed way. And each cell receives messages from roughly 10,000 other cells and sends messages out to another 10,000. So not only are the cells densely packed, they're also densely interconnected. And it's all of this packing and interconnection that allows the brain to work the magic of building out this rich and textured experience of consciousness that we often take for granted as we move through life. If we remember that the brain cells are each of them similar in fundamental ways to the single cell free living organism we call a paramecium, and if we provisionally assume that each cell has its own little bit of inner life, its own sentience, then we can begin to have a quality of amazement as we think about all of these little individual beings cooperating with one another and providing for us the rich and textured experience of life. For instance, walking along a seashore in bare feet on a pleasant day. All of it brought to us by these little living beings. So we talked about the cell body and its diffuse sense of aliveness that is part of our experience no matter where we look at any given moment with our attention. So the cell body as a diffuse and cooperative collection of individual beings. This is a kind of practice that I engage in to help myself feel connected with life in a very intimate and very pleasing way in my estimation. So the inner experience brought to us by all these individual cells, and for tactile experience, having a lot to do with the cells of the skin and also their communication with all the cells up in the brain. Now the skin as an organ provides a sense of containment. If we try to decide where we as individuals stop and the outer world starts, the skin surface is the most natural boundary to think about. And indeed, in biological and physical terms, the skin does separate us from the environment. It does provide containment. At the same time, the skin is open to signals and stimuli from the outer world. It opens us to the tactile experiences, such as walking along the beach. A nice meditation can be to begin to tune into the skin surface and feel how it provides a sense of enwrapping. It wraps around us, more or less embraces and protects us, and at the same time how it also connects us or opens us to the tactile world. We can feel slight breezes and pressure points and so on. So I suggest that as a meditation to adopt in your daily life. It can even be done while you're moving about doing other things. So we've been talking about sensitivity from the perspective of the skin. And of course, there's sensitivity that comes to us through our eyes and ears and noses and mouths. All of these organs of sensitivity feed into various regions of the brain. A lot is known about how the sense organs connect with the brain and where their primary inputs go, etc. And we have, in another region of the brain, a lot of complexity that builds out this capacity to identify features of the environment, set them apart as apparently separate objects, and give them names. So the objectifier that we've talked about is also another function of the brain, just as the body map on the surface of the skin that we saw before is a function of the brain, and so on. Well, within the brain, there's yet more going on. In particular, there's the famous limbic system that mediates a lot of our emotional experience. This is in the deeper regions of the brain, but just like those other regions, this area is processing information, handling incoming signals, making sense of them, etc. It makes a different kind of sense than that provided by the objectifier, but of course emotions are very valuable as we make decisions. And the objectifier can look back upon the emotions and use them to contribute to its own analysis. And it names the emotions and, in a sense, objectifies them. That's its job. In fact, as the objectifier looks around and does all this, it begins to build up this quality of what we call a self. So our sense of being a self who has emotions and thoughts and bodily sensations and can see and hear things out in the apparent outer world is, just like all of those experiences, mediated, to a large degree at least, by the cells in our brain. And this animation is showing brain cells in action as various mental states pass through the organ. This animation shows about 1/1,000,000th of the actual cell firing rate in the brain, which generates all of our experiences. And this sense of being a self who is having all these experiences is provided for us by these brain cells, just like everything else. And it's possible to gradually dissolve that sense of self and to allow even the objectifier function to seem like just another phenomenon in experience. And so we have this ongoing experience of being a person who has private feelings and thoughts and sensations. Of course, we also have an experience of the outer world in all of our hearing and seeing and so on. Clearly, the inner experience is more vivid. It feels more intimate. It's closer to us in a certain sense. But besides those differences, it's fundamentally simply another phenomenon. So the universe body experience is one of beginning to get a felt understanding, a felt knowing of how everything that happens in our lives is in a certain way, a certain important way, biological. So touch is biological, but so is the sense of being a person who feels touch. So going back to the contrasting qualities of containment and openness, as we become more aware of and tuned into the universe body, we gradually emphasize openness and at least temporarily let go of the sense of being so tightly and separately contained. So that rather than feeling alone inside a boundary that divides us from other people, we can feel diffusely connected, so that outer experience and inner experience is known as arbitrary separation between an ongoing flow of experience that spreads throughout body and world as we experience them. So this brings us to the end of our sensitivity series. I hope you'll continue to work with these concepts and meditations that have been presented. We can use biology to remind ourselves how deeply embedded and interwoven we are with the world and how our experience is really just a seamless whole provided to us as a kind of gift by all the trillions of cells in our living mammalian bodies. Thank you for your interest in mindful biology.